So we are in the last Torah portion of the book of Genesis. When I'm done teaching, we will say our traditional chazak, chazak, v'nit chazek. If I forget, I believe that is Sherry Manning's role in oratory to remind me, because I'm very likely to forget after my finished teaching. Now, in reading the section that I've taken from this Torah portion, first of all, we have to remind ourselves that Torah is literature. It's not simple prose. It's not just telling a story in a dime-back novel. There's great intentionality behind it. And what part of what literature means is that there are many, many levels to the text. Secondly, I want to say that the text I'm going to study has always bothered me. I've never looked far enough to solve those problems. I've gone to other places in the Parsha. I want to thank Sherry for pointing out to me a fabulous lecture by Aviva Zornberg on the Parsha, and the lecture just completely opened my eyes, my heart, my mind to what's happening in this Parsha. And what I'm sharing with you is mostly from her hour-and-a-half lecture. I'll, of course, have to make this more brief and focus on a few things for myself that were not the exact focus of her talk. All right, so let me give you just the backstory for anybody who's not been reading Torah assiduously for the past few months. The story of Joseph and his brothers, in a way, has hit its apex. Because of their envy of him, their resentment of him, they wanted to murder him. They threw him in a pit. They wanted to kill him, but they relented and sold him into slavery. He was in Egypt. You'll remember he he got out of prison, was able to interpret the dreams of Pharaoh, that there would be 7 years of plenty and then 7 years of famine, allowing Egypt to help the world survive, because nations could go to Egypt and buy provisions. Among the nations that went to Egypt to buy provisions was his family back in Canaan. Jacob sent his sons. Of course, and we have the dramatic scenes of Joseph re-meeting his brothers, after a decade or so, and his wondering if they have really repented. So Joseph contrived tests to see what kind of people they were, and his great test was ultimately to put a goblet in the pack of his brother Benjamin, Joseph's full brother, another half brother of the other brothers, and perhaps Joseph assumed that the other brothers would hate Benjamin just as much as they hated Joseph. He didn't know anything about them. He didn't know if they had transformed, and this would be his test. Once the goblet is discovered in Benjamin's pack, the truth comes out, and Judah comes up to Joseph, and he repents everything. He tells them the story. He tells them who he is, and then Joseph reveals himself to his brothers, and he cries, and the brothers cry, and all of Egypt cries. We have this moment of great reconciliation. We have, just as the name Judah implies, the Hebrew word Judah is from the word l'hodot, which means to confess. It means to thank and to acknowledge. So you might say the word Judah came to its fruition here. Things seem to be settled as we move into this Torah portion. Jacob is blessing Joseph's children, Ephraim and Manasseh. It's a very interesting scene. Jacob knows that he's going to die. Before he dies, he wants to give a blessing. Now, this is what Aviva Zornberg focused on. I won't focus on it, but it's very ironic. You'll see in the beginning of chapter 49, it says, Jacob called his sons and said, "Assemble yourselves, and I will tell you what will happen in Acharit Hayamim, at the end of days." So what we expect to see here is some kind of eschatology, some kind of teaching about the end of times. And the Midrash says that Jacob forgot all of that right away. He completely forgot what he was going to say. It's as if an angel of God came and said, "You're actually not going to say any of that." And instead what he did was, quote unquote, bless the brothers. Now, this is called the blessing of Jacob, but if you read through it, there's hardly any blessing here. You might say that Jacob has kept for himself his own judgment and resentment of his sons having tried to kill Joseph. This has, of course, plagued Jacob very, very deeply. and the blessings show the great pain and suffering he's lived in. And most of his life was pain and suffering, to be honest, but especially all that time that he lived with the absence of Joseph. He thought the ghost of Joseph, as was put last week, I think by Ruth, the ghost of Joseph, because he thought Joseph was dead. So not only was Rachel dead, his favored wife, but his son Joseph was dead. And we can just imagine the devastation that this wrought on Jacob. Now, even though he now knows that Joseph is alive, it doesn't mean that that past trauma has ended for him. That kind of trauma sinks very deeply into a human being. And although we can, as it were, reestablish our life after trauma, that doesn't mean that the trauma goes away. There's been interesting discussions what it means to grow up in a home of traumatized Jacob. He again, I think much of his life, the trauma of what his mother conspired with him to do to his brother, the trauma of leaving home. I think the very unpleasant circumstances of living with Laban, his wife Rachel dying. He thinks his son Joseph has died. So the man has had a difficult life, not just in physical hardship, the usual difficulty of making a living, but also one devastating event after another. So I believe Zornberg said it all comes out here because he forgot what he was going to say. Now, the most he has to say, the best things he has to say are for Judah. I was just looking it over, and in the great blessing of Judah in chapter 4 and verse 12, it says, red-eyed from wine and white tooth from milk. White tooth from milk sounds nice, but the idea, red-eyed from wine, that he's been drinking all night. So it looks like Judah might have a problem with alcohol. We're not sure. So Jacob sneaks that at the end of this wonderful blessing of Judah. Anyway, on to what we're going to talk about. Then Pharaoh gives them permission to go back up to Canaan. Joseph is buried in the cave of Machpelah, where all the ancestors except Rachel are buried. He wants to be buried there as well. And hold on just one second, please. I got a little bit of noise here over on the side. Okay. He wants to be buried there as well. Joseph is buried. And then when they arrive back from Canaan, now we're going to get into our text. It says in, hold on a second, folks. I have a little buzz going on in my phone. I got to take care of something here. Okay, I think that's going to do it. I have the phone ready just in case I need. Mirav, who's usually sitting right in front of me, needs to tell me something urgent, and so I want to make sure that I have her ready in case there's something I'm not seeing that I need to be aware of. So, Mirav, I've gotten rid of my phone, so if you have something to say, you'll have to say it to Yosh, who will communicate to me. Sorry. Oh, okay, great. All good. Oh, so yeah, have your speaker on, dear. So we are in verse 15 now. Look in chapter 50, verse 15. It says, Vayir'u ache Yosef ki met avihem. This is very mysterious. They saw that their father had died. Well, he had already died a long time ago. They had embalmed him, taken him all the way down to Egypt and buried him. What could it possibly mean that they saw that he had died? One interpretation is, this is from the Midrash, Zornberg talks about this, the Vayir'u, what they had seen is the enormity of what they'd done. The full consequences of what they had done now comes to them. I saw a very interesting Midrash that says, on the way back from Canaan, so Joseph and his brothers and the whole entourage are going from Canaan to Egypt, they passed by the pit into which Joseph had been thrown. Now, I want you just to try to imagine this. They're going by it. Joseph stops the caravan and walks over and looks into the pit. What are the brothers thinking? The brothers are thinking, oh, no, that's the same pit. Joseph is thinking, this is the same pit into which you threw me. So we can just imagine. Now, all the Midrash says is, they said this because they saw the pit on their way back to Egypt. We have to imagine the depth of the scene. Again, the Midrash is not in the Torah, but it's a very suggestive Midrash of what they're carrying and what Joseph is carrying. So what do they see? They saw the pit on the way back to Egypt. What do they fully comprehend? What they did to Joseph, what they did to their father, what they did to the family. And it's not as if they didn't get it before, but one thing they perceive, understand is the forgiveness that went on earlier in the in Torah portion Vayigash and after, that only went so far. And I would say Torah, in addition to being a great literature, as you see, is also great archetypal psychology in the sense that what happens in the Torah is not what happened then, it's what happens all the time in and between human beings. What are they realizing? Even with the reconciliation, that doesn't mean the trauma goes away. Their apology does not wipe out the trauma. Joseph forgiving them does not wipe out the trauma. There's a great residue, the resentment and the anger and the murder, and the attempted murder and the suffering. There's a residue that still exists. And in my mind, peering into the pit brings all that up. From this perspective, Joseph keeps it to himself. He probably thinks to himself, why open this wound? I'm in charge now. I'm in the place of my father. I have to heal this family. It doesn't mean that everything's better. Now, so then the Torah gives us the insight of the brothers, and the brothers say, and now we're in verse 15. Vayomru lu yistamenu Yosef. Now, the word satam here, which means okay, we're all good? Yeah, I have a notice on my screen, please. Yeah, thank you. The word satam means to hate deeply. The only other time we've seen this in the book of Genesis is when it says, Vayistom Esav et Yaakov. Esav hated Jacob and planned to kill him. So when they say lu yistamenu, lu means perhaps, or it might be the case. It's used in the Torah in both negative and positive ways. Here it is a sense of despair. The possibility of something catastrophic going to happen. Just as Esau planned to kill Jacob, Joseph now will plan to kill us. So they said, here in the English, perhaps Joseph will nurse hatred against us. The Hebrew is, again, let me find the word, satam, yistamenu Yosef. This is what Abigail chanted a little bit earlier. V'hashev yashiv lanu et hara'a asher gamalnu oto. He will impose upon us the evil that we did to him. Now, the Hebrew word gamal is very interesting because, of course, we have the oxymoron gemilut chasadim. Ligmol means to give someone what they deserve. For example, in military, a pulat gumul or tagbul means a retaliatory action. So the word gamal can mean give someone what they deserve in a good way. It can also mean to retaliate. We have a blessing called Birkat Gomel. When somebody survives a terrible incident, we say that God has gamal alai tova. God has saved me from something terrible. But the idea when they say the word, let me get my place again. When they say kol hara'a asher gamalnu oto, it means we deserve it. He deserves to retaliate. He, in the natural order of things, he should retaliate. We tried to murder him. We called him great suffering. But Joseph did get out of prison. What the commentators talk here about the suffering of Jacob. What they did was a horrible, horrible thing to their father. Even though Joseph came out of prison, they sold him into Egyptian slavery, and they did something terrible, terrible to their father. So now they prevaricate. The Midrash, by the way, assumes this. They said, yeah, sometimes you got to prevaricate in order to avoid catastrophe, meaning they have to tell a lie so that Joseph himself doesn't execute them, because as it were, God has things in mind for the 12 tribes. God doesn't want them executed, and we'll see a little bit later. Even Joseph has his reasons for not executing them, but they want to preempt this by just making up, as the Midrash says, they made up this last will and testament of Jacob that he's not to harm them. So it says they instructed that Joseph be told, "Your father gave orders before his death, saying, 'Thus shall you say to Joseph, oh, please, kindly forgive,'" I'm reading from the English here, "'the flagrant offense of your brothers and their sin, for they have done evil. So now, please, forgive the flagrant offense of the servants of your father's God.'" So the Hebrew is "Va'ata sana lefesha avdei Elohecha avicha." Now, pesha is worse than a sin. It's a crime. It's an outrageous transgression. By the way, the line you see here is taken straight into our high holiday liturgy. The idea of if the world were fair, God would retaliate against us. If the world were fair, if God were, as it were, a fair judge, we would receive a very severe sentence. This is the assumption in Yom Kippur. So that's why on Yom Kippur, during the high holidays in general, we see the two dimensions of God. God is Avinu and Malkeinu. Malkeinu, the judge, when God sits on the throne of judgment, and Avinu, the loving parent, when God sits on the throne of compassion. So they're asking Joseph to not judge them fairly, because retaliation and vengeance would actually be fair. That's what justice would require. However, they want Joseph to have the quality of mercy. And in the Midrashim, they actually say that Joseph, as he thought about this, he thought of the merciful God who got him out of the pit, who guided him to this moment. And therefore, just as God acted in mercy and compassion toward him, this is the Midrash sharing with us Joseph's ruminations. So should Joseph do this with his brothers. And this is "And Joseph wept." Now, here's something that Zornberg pointed out that I think is quite brilliant. Why did he weep? And I think this is probably right in the biblical text. He wept because he realized all the unfinished business. He realized that, and again, I'm going to go back to when he saw the pit, they're terrified of me because they assume I'm not done. And they assume rightly. And this is where I want to go into a little bit of depth. Of course, Joseph is not done. We don't forget about trauma. Trauma can still haunt us. In fact, I was, some time ago, I counseled a family where a young man and his mother were estranged from each other. And I remember asking, "So what's going on?" He says, "Well, I suffered trauma when I was a kid." So I said, "Well, can you tell me about it?" And he went on to say what I would describe as, when I teach the Parenting the Soul of the Child class, and all the things that I try to share with parents not to do with their child. Well, it seems like his mother hit the negative boxes. Every mistake one can make, short of physical violence, that one ought not do to a child, this person did. And as he described it, I said, that trauma is real. I said, I don't think any amount of therapy is going to erase that, nor should it. It's part of your identity of human being. To erase that, you would not be an authentic person. So the question is not erasing trauma. The question is, what do you do with trauma? Meaning, is there a good reason? Is there a good motivation to overcome estrangement? Now, I think that's a basic value. I mean, if we at all can, we should overcome estrangement with family, if we at all can. And sometimes overcoming estrangement means I will have the trauma, but I won't think about it. Or more accurately, because of the wisdom practice that I teach, whenever you sit in what I would call the second practice of just inquiring what's happening in the unconscious ego self, if you've suffered trauma, it will come up. Now, from my perspective, we ought allow it to come up, because if we don't allow it to come up, it will symptomize. It will act in the dark. I've taken a line from the Kabbalah that just as there's a tree of life, there's a tree of death. And the tree of death grows in the dark. And if we do not keep track of what is happening in our shadow, in the unconscious self, it turns from a small little weed or a bush that we can trim into something gigantic. And two things can happen. it can really tear away at our own being if all we are is filled with the trauma that actually happened. So when someone says you have to get over it, I don't think that's the right thing to say with a person who suffered trauma. You're not going to get over it. And I think if you do spiritual work, especially work in the shadow, in a way, you want to bring it up so you can trim that tree down to manageable size. So what does one do with trauma? One has to work it, and one has to, as it were, and this might be daily for some people, weekly for another, consciously reconstruct your life in spite of it. And again, why do I say this? If you think you've gotten over it, if you erase it, it probably will symptomize. Now, I think this is part of our job as human beings. Remember, we have an overriding value of reconciliation, and therefore we have an overriding value of working through trauma if we can and working with it if we can. So when I think of the archetype of Joseph, and I really never had this before because, sometimes the archetype of Joseph is the grandiose one, the one who lords himself above others. In fact, there's a midrash that I really don't like that asks, why did Joseph die first? Because he acted b'rabbanut. And here the word rabbanut is from the word rav. It means he acted he lorded himself over him. I don't like that because the archetype of Joseph that I'm carrying with me, because I've known so many people who've carried trauma, is the man who's carried deep trauma. And if we look at his life, and if it's right, as Samuel Levine has shown in his book, that Joseph may have been, as it were, on the spectrum, meaning he really couldn't read other people well. If he had a dream, he thought he's supposed to share his dream with his family. If God told him he were destined to great things, well, that's God's choice. Whatever charismatic gifts Joseph had, he didn't earn them. He was born with them, so he should just share it with other people, and they should all talk about the reality of the fact that Joseph is charismatic. Now, if he is, as it were, on the spectrum, he doesn't know about these things. He doesn't know what you say and you don't say. He doesn't read other people well. Now he's gotten to a point in life where he realizes where something that he was born with, both the charismatic gifts and his difficulty in reading other people, it led him to the pit. It led him to slavery. It led him to be absent from his family, and now he's back here. So I don't want to belabor this point, but part of my archetype of Joseph is the person who has been traumatized, and when his brothers say, we deserve retaliation, Joseph weeps because he actually feels it. When they say, please forgive us of the pesha, the horrible thing we've done, in my imagination, Joseph is saying, you're absolutely right. You have done something horrible, and I'm not going to retaliate, although I could retaliate. I have the right to retaliate. Right? Justice would require that I retaliate, but I'm not going to. I don't want to be that person. And this is another thing I think about Joseph, is the question is not what happened to you to explain your future. And you've heard me say many times, who are we as human beings? 4 things. Our genetics, our personality, number 1. There's an oversize what happens to us in early childhood. There's that. Everything since our childhood goes into the mix of who we are. Our minds, our souls, our brains never stop developing. And then the 4th thing is our history of decisions, conscious and unconscious, including the decision today, what kind of person you want to become tomorrow. And I put that last one as the most important thing in shaping who we are as human beings. You have a personality, you had an early childhood, everything that's happened to you since. You've made many decisions through your life, some conscious, some unconscious, but here you are today. The most important decision any human being has to make is, what kind of person do I want to be tomorrow? Now, why do I say tomorrow? Because I've known many people who had a very bad day. They feel a lot of tough things in their hearts, and I say, don't make a decision now, sleep on it. Decide who you're going to be tomorrow. And, a good night's sleep and dreaming the dreams sometimes helps a person reset. So it's not what kind of person you want to be today, because Joseph may have said to himself, actually, today I want to retaliate. Today I'm up for vengeance. And the idea is, well, sleep on it. What kind of person do you want to be tomorrow? So Joseph cries because the enormity of this situation hits him. And the brothers see this, meaning there's that, for example, that unspoken moment between Jacob and Esau with a pot of stew, where Esau comes in and says, "I'll sell you I need your stew," and Jacob says, "Yeah, I'll sell you a bowl of soup for the birthright." And my drash on that is they both know exactly what's going on. Jacob deserves the birthright. Esau wants to be rid of it. And I imagine this knowing glance between the two brothers, perhaps even knowing that if I don't get this birthright off my shoulders, it's going to end very badly. Jacob perhaps saying, I know I'm supposed to have it, and if you don't give it to me voluntarily, this is going to end very badly. They have that moment, and then Esau says, fine, give me the bowl of stew, I'll give you the birthright. That knowing moment where everything is communicated in one moment, eye-to-eye moment between people. In fact, it's so deep it can't be said. Last night, Shanti read a beautiful poem on all the levels of consciousness, the swirl of consciousness, everything happening at the same time, grief and joy happening at the same time. So I have this image that everything is communicated in that one glance. It cannot possibly said, it cannot possibly all be written, but we've all had those moments. When Joseph cries, they know what's up. They don't know what he's going to do next. And then in verse 18, it says, his brothers themselves also went and flung themselves before him and said, we're ready to be your slaves. Now, part of the Midrash says this was kind of a prophetic moment. They knew that slavery awaited them. I'm going to put that aside. Part of what they're saying is, whatever you're thinking, we know we deserve it. Whatever you're thinking, we know we deserve it. Now, here comes a line in the Bible that I've never liked. I've avoided teaching this line because I think it does reek a little bit of pomposity, and it reeks of insincerity. And it also conveys a sentiment that I actually really don't like. And so I'll read it, and then I want to thank Viva Zornberg for relieving me of the hardness in my heart toward this verse, because the hardness in my heart toward this verse was covering something that ended up being very, very deep, a deep well of meaning that her teaching allowed me to tap into. Joseph says, "Fear not, for am I instead of God?" On one hand, implying, if there's any retaliation or punishment to be done, God's going to take care of it. I'm not going to be the judge of you. Now, part of that is saying, if I were God, if I were the judge, I might. But I'm not God. And there's been a godly presence through this whole thing that he can't quite understand. Can't quite understand that their desire to murder him, sell him into slavery, into Potiphar's house, into Egyptian prison, out of the prison, interpret the dreams of Pharaoh, sustaining the entire world, the brothers coming down here. There's something too mysterious here to comprehend. Now, is this all God? Did God all plan this? As I said in my Shabbat thought, I have a tough time believing in predestination. I have a tough time believing that things are meant to be and it's all been foreseen. I have a tough time with it. But there are some times in life where you sit back and say, I can't account for this. I can't account for what's happening. On one hand, I don't want to be presumptuous enough to think that God has paid such attention to me to conspire world events in my favor. But on the other hand, I've known people, and now and then Mirav and I felt this ourselves, being the recipient of blessings that we simply could not comprehend. Some of you people out there are the people who have channeled those blessings toward us, and we're eternally grateful. Although you intended harm, he says this accurately, God intended it for good, in order to accomplish. It is as clear this day that a vast people was kept alive. So Joseph is saying it all ended up with where we are at this day. Egypt has been able to keep the neighboring world alive. Perhaps that was God's plan. Now, that doesn't mean, as I wrote in my Shabbat thought, that because something worked out, that people are then not judged for their immoral actions. They're both true at the same time. They did something horrible. They did not intend for things to work out. God intended for things to work out. And it's too mysterious to figure out. And part of what Joseph has said is something like the following, which again, I counsel myself, I counsel others. I'm going to frame this differently. If I frame this in terms of have been a victim of the perfidy of the brothers, he said, I will be a hateful person and I might kill somebody. Okay? Joseph knows that. But then he says to himself, perhaps, I don't want to be filled with hate and I don't want to have the blood of my brothers on my hands. Something terrible happened and I've decided to not be the person that catastrophe produces. I'm going to reframe this whole thing. And this is one of the most important things we can do in spiritual and psychological growth, is when you look at the facts of your life, sometimes we can just choose a different interpretation of the facts. We call this framing. Yes, this happened, but what I do with it, what I will be tomorrow, is not necessitated by what's happened. It's necessitated by the way that I frame it. Now, what I share to myself and other people is you can't make something up. You can't frame your life in a way that's totally unjustified because it won't be psychologically and morally authentic. But you might say this story has allowed Joseph, when he talks to his brother, he says, well, I'm going to frame it differently. You meant harm. God meant it for good. The world has been saved. How about if we leave it at that? Now, that doesn't mean, and this is what I had trouble with, when I read this all these years, I thought Joseph meant it as opposed to Joseph was being strategically insincere. And that really saved it for me. Because you've probably heard me teach many times when people have something to say, and I say, well, don't say that because it's going to make things worse. They say, well, aren't I supposed to tell the truth? And I say, not really, because there's a higher truth. So if a person wants to tell the truth to one's spouse or children about how you feel, I say, there's a higher truth of reconciliation. There's a higher truth of making things better for everybody. So if you say exactly what you're thinking, exactly what you're feeling, yeah, it factually represents what you want to say, but it'll make everything worse. So some things we just keep to ourselves and we have to work them through. Why? Because we don't want to cause damage. We don't want to cause evil. Now, that does not mean we don't think it. That does not mean we don't feel our feelings. So, in the practice that I teach, we feel all our feelings. We think all of our thoughts, and then we decide with the higher self, what exactly should I say? What exactly should I do? Realizing, and this is where the vision comes in, my vision for myself is to live in good relations with other people. Now, you have to hold people to account, but you can hold people to account in such a way where you don't want to rob them of their humanity. You don't want to grind them down if one has a lifelong relationship with people. This is very, very complex. And as I look at this, especially with Aviva Zornberg's help and the Midrash, this is an extraordinary example of things that I've been teaching, and I never saw them here. And this is one reason I'm so moved to be teaching this. So he says, fear not, I'll sustain you and your young ones. And then here's a line that Aviva Zornberg makes a lot about, and I think properly. It says, hold on a second. He says, Anochi achalkel etchem, I'm going to take care of you and your young children. Vayinachem otam vayedaber al libam. He comforted them and spoke al libam, upon their hearts. It's a very rare phrase in Hebrew because the authentic Hebrew phrase, as Aviva Zornberg teaches, is vaydiber el libam, ledaber lev el halev, a really heart-to-heart conversation. Ledaber al libam, to comfort them, which is, I'm not going to say the truth. I'm not going to open my heart out to you. I'm not going to be vulnerable to you. I'm going to speak upon your heart in order to comfort you, in order for you not to fear what I might do next. Now, the Midrash then fills that in. There's a long phrase. I brought my Midrash Rabbi out here to read it. But he says all kinds of things to tell them that I won't, don't worry, I'm not going to do anything. By the way, with the Midrash quotes, there's nothing that says, hey, it's all good. You were young, I was young, it was a bad day. He doesn't do any of that. Meaning he doesn't want them to feel, yeah, we were kids. Well, once you've had your bar mitzvah, you're no longer a kid. And we're going to assume that all these young men were after their bar mitzvahs. By the way, if you're not morally responsible after a bar mitzvah, don't have a bar mitzvah. Once you have a bar mitzvah, bar bat mitzvah, you are morally obligated. Now, you might do terrible things after your bar bat mitzvah, but you are obligated to apologize. So if you're 30 and you remember something you did when you were 14, you can't say, well, I was a kid. You can say, well, I was a bar bat mitzvah, so I have to now go back and make better. So Joseph doesn't want to say, hey, it's all good, we were kids. No, that doesn't actually excuse anything. So what kind of thing does Joseph say? Here's where we have Rashi, our great commentator, quoting the Midrash Tanchuma. Again, I never studied the Midrash Tanchuma on this parsha, and Rashi brings it down. And Aviva Zornberg brought down the Rashi in the talk that I put a link to, and that I'm citing. Let's say I want to go to. So I'm at the very end of the book of Genesis, Parshat Vayechi. And Rashi is commenting on Joseph speaking upon their heart, comforting them, speaking upon their heart. So Rashi says, Devarim hamit kablim al halev, things that their heart can hear and accept. And he says, Ad shelo yiradatem lakan, hayu merananim alai shani eved, ve'al yedechem noda shani ben chorim. People used to gossip about me and say I was a slave. Because how they get to know me? I was brought up by Midian caravan to be sold as a slave. I arrived in Egypt and was sold as a slave. I'm an ex-con. I was in prison for a couple of years. So everybody says Joseph the slave. Joseph who arrived here as a slave. The slave born. And when people gossip, they love to say things about someone's past to put them down. Now, Aviva Zornberg says that when the family arrived, you might say Jacob was actually a leader in the land of Canaan. He was a chieftain. He was, as it were, a prince in his own land. And when they arrived, they said, oh, so you are descended from great people. You're descended from a chieftain from the land of Canaan, of the grandson of Abraham, the son of Isaac. And so Joseph says, when you arrived, my stature went up. They no longer talk to me as Joseph the slave, but Joseph was born a free man with great lineage to a great family. So he says, well, this would be acceptable to them, because then he says, Vani horegetchem, and if I were to kill you, ma briot omrim, what would the people out there say? Kat shel bachurim ra'a v'nishtabach bahem. A group of young men came down, and Joseph glorified himself by them. Va'amar achayhem, and he said, those are my brothers. Ulvesok haragotam, and in the end, he killed them. And then this incredible verse from Tanchuma that is really, it chills the bones. So this is Joseph speaking to them. He said, it's not in my interest to kill you, to tell you the truth. I could, maybe I should, but I won't, because it's not in my interest. Because your being here shows everybody I'm no longer Joseph the slave. I'm high-born Joseph, and that's in my benefit. And if I kill you, after I've been glorifying myself in you all this time, if I kill you, people are going to say that they were a group of well-bred young men. And then Joseph, according to the Tanchuma that Rashi quotes, Joseph concludes in this way, asking rhetorically, Yesh ha'af shehoreg et echav? Is there such a thing as a brother who kills his brothers? Now, in the Midrash Rabbah that I overhear, they give a much more wordy version. The version in the Tanchuma, of course, makes you stop because, yeah, we've heard about that. We heard about Cain and Hevel. We heard about that. We heard about Esav and Jacob. with the intention to murder. Has there ever been a brother who wanted to kill his brothers? Absolutely. So on one hand, Joseph is asking a rhetorical question, where in the world would a brother want to kill a brother? And the answer is, well, in the book of Genesis to start. Like we're in this book. We're featured in this mini-series. Yeah, it's kind of what this mini-series is about. So the Tanhuma, Joseph puts that down, and it chills the story deeply, and we suddenly realize this is what the book has been about. One of the things this book has been about is Cain and Abel over and over and over again. In every generation, Cain and Abel over and over again. And back when Judah and Joseph reconciled, I used to teach that as the high point. That the tragedy of Cain and Abel, the tragedy of Isaac and Ishmael, the tragedy of Esau and Jacob, the tragedy of the brothers of Joseph and Joseph, in the reconciliation between Judah and Joseph, and by extension, all the brothers, that has come to an end. And I remember feeling really good about that because I never read this Torah portion deeply enough, because I didn't like the idea of Joseph saying, yeah, it all worked out in the end. I really don't like it when people say that. Sometimes people say, well, it was meant to be. There are days I break character. I break the fourth wall and say, meant by whom? Who meant this to be? Especially if someone says it to somebody in a way that is, it's after a funeral. They say to the bereaved, well, this was meant to be. I feel I have to save the bereaved person because they're looking at the person quite oddly. Something horrible has happened. This was meant to be. I say, oh, so meant by whom? Well, isn't everything meant to be? I said, I don't think so. I can think of a lot of things in history. I think a lot of things right now that I don't think are meant to be. Well, doesn't God make everything? Isn't it all meant to be? I said, I don't think so. I don't believe in predestination. I don't believe that everything that happens, I just want you to take a pause and think about it. I just want you to take a deep breath. What's happening in the world today? I'm particularly troubled, as I would assume most of you are, by the Russian invasion of Ukraine and the reckless, utter, unnecessary devastation, murder, and mayhem. And then I think about ISIS a while back, and I think about the genocide in the Balkans, and I think about the genocide in Rwanda. God, I could just keep going back through history, and I think to myself, oh, this was meant to be? Someone, as it were, the divine planned all this? This is one of the reasons that I cannot believe fully in the idea of a God who manages history. There's too much evil. Now, are there moments when God's will breaks through? I have to say yes. But I'm not going to say that things are meant to be or God makes that meant to be. And, and oftentimes, again, I would say this because the family is so hurt when a person says it's meant to be. The person says, oh, you're right. Obviously not everything's meant to be. And then the family says, I've already met with the family. And when people say why, I say, I don't know why. I don't know why the good die young. I don't know why tragedies happen. If someone's really interested, I'll talk about my Kabbalistic theory of the shells and the husk and the randomness and the Sitra Achra, if someone really wants to know. And I said, I don't understand it. Evil things do happen. And now the question is, what are we going to do when something horrendous has happened? Do we multiply the tragedy by folding our tent, going to ground and never coming out again? We can do that. There are people who have done that. Or do we respond to tragedy by after a period of mourning, by reasserting ourselves in life and committing ourselves to creating as much good as possible with the time and spirit that we have left? So when I read this, it brought back, I taught the Holocaust for 10 years, as you know. I read the papers, I see stuff, and I say, oh, it was all meant to be. I didn't want to touch it. It was like radioactive for me. And then when Aviva Zornberg says, he didn't mean it. It never occurred to me. And I remember, this is literature. This is literature. You write a story where someone says something, and then we realize they didn't mean it. They just said something insincere because they didn't want to say what they really wanted to say, which was a moral achievement. So my thought Thursday, as I was writing this out for my Shabbat thought, I had this insight. Sometimes insincerity is a great moral achievement. The person who does not say what they're actually thinking, does not say what they're actually feeling. The person who says, I won't create any good by saying that. So I'll just say to the brothers who really did a horrific thing, yeah, so something good came out of it. We better stop talking right now. Because if you say one word and I say one word, this is not going to go well. So how about if I just usher some kind of bromide, kind of a fatuous saying, yeah, all turned out well. Let's leave it there. And then what we, of course, is left with for me, the profound and deep archetype of Joseph that I'm certainly not done with this is, what does it mean to be Joseph? They get back to Goshen. They go back to their place. Joseph goes back to the palace. He's a viceroy. He has an empire to manage. And I just imagine Joseph. I have my, my image of Joseph frequenting the Nile Bar and Grill, where the bartenders whose life he saved, he opened up this is my fantasy, he opened up the Nile Bar and Grill, and Joseph gets back from Canaan, he goes down to the bar. Bartender says, how's it going? And Joseph says, man, you would not believe what just happened. And he says, what happened? He says, first, I want you to high five me for keeping my mouth shut. He goes, okay, preemptive high five, now tell me about it. So this is my end of the story. Joseph having a drink with his buddy, the bartender, and Joseph saying to the bartender what he didn't say to his brothers. All right, I'm going to end my talk here.